All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm Debbie Lee. I'm with the WVCTSI Center of Excellence. I'm the training coordinator and facilitator for today. We have a lot of experience on the phone with us today. We have our Shelley Welch, who is our co-director here with the Clinical Trials Center of Excellence. She's been with CTSI for 3 years. Prior, she was with a CRO. Also presenting is Michelle Beatty. She's been at the university for 7 years. She has her BS in accounting from Fairmont State University. We also have Susan Crayne. She is our grants research coordinator for CTSI. She's actually been at WVU for 8 years, and I hope that I did all this math correctly too. Missy Hunt has been at the university. She actually got her master's and BS here at WVU, and she's been working at the university for 12 years. She's currently the assistant director for tax services. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let me go through some objectives of what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things we're going to talk about is how to get started when creating a budget, right? It's probably why you guys are all here, right? Because we're going to talk about budgets. Next is what items to include in your budget. Understand contract payments. And then once again, going back to that U-bit, so understanding that, Missy's going to go over that for us. So once again, as we go through the presentation, feel free to put any questions in chat. Feel free to take yourself off mute and to talk to us and give us. And so sorry, of course, my computer needs restarted, but I'm just going to snooze that till later. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with budgets. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Beatty.
Good morning. My main focus is on industry-sponsored budgets, so that's what I will be discussing today. Next. You will need to do an independent review of local cost, as well as an opportunity to compare cost and see if the budget that the sponsor has offered is adequate. Anything that is not will need to be changed. Site startup fees are very important. Those include things for things such as regulatory, accounting fees. We also have pharmacy fees. Those will be for the setup as well as the renewal for each year. A lot of times that also includes things for dosing. We have IRB fees, which is the submission, preparation, regulatory, continuing review, and amendment. Monitoring visit, we usually charge for our time to set that up as well as the time for the visit. And chart review is another cost that we need to consider, and that is for our coordinators and the amount of time that they spend on each patient to determine if they are eligible for the study. It also includes case report form completion. Its case report form is for each patient, and it is what is turned into the sponsor. Local or central labs, if it is a central lab, you charge for the amount of time that it takes to do the draw and get the shipping ready. Local will be the cost that it's going to cost us from the hospital. We also have the Clinical Trial Center of Excellence registration fee. Currently that is set at $9.75. Every trial has to be registered with them. Also important is the study closeout fee. You are going to have to meet with the sponsor to make sure that they have all the documentation that they need. We also need to charge a document archiving storage fee to ensure that we can pay for that, for the documents to be stored until we are able to destruct them. Sometimes that's 7 years. I'm going to let actually our pharmacist step in for a moment and discuss when pharmacy fees are necessary.
Is Lisa or Sabrina on?
I don't see either one of them in the chat or in the participant list. The only ones there's an Innovation Center, which I don't believe is them.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, hi, Lisa. Sorry about that.
Hi, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Lisa Gibbons, and thanks so much for including us in this topic, Michelle. A couple thoughts about when to bring pharmacy in. So whenever you have a drug study, pharmacy needs to be notified, and depending on whether it's investigator initiated or if it's sponsor related or if there's grant, kind of drives how we determine a budget. And so we want to support investigator initiated, and so sometimes they don't have the money to cover pharmacy costs, and in that instance we would have them cover cost of drug, especially if it's something that we need to get from them. But if it's sponsor related, we have administrative setup fees. We have a whole fee sheet that typically when we get a site qualification visit, we get part of the protocol or, a synopsis, but as soon as that budget starts to be worked up, we need to be included in the conversation. If anybody doesn't quite understand how to go about that, what happens is you reach out to us, email us the protocol, and then say you're under budgets, we're doing budgets right now. If we could get a fee sheet on this, we'd be happy to send one over. And typically we try to do a 24 to 48 hour turnaround. And so we know that sometimes when pharmacy is thought of, you're already in the process of doing contract. So just tell us if you need it sooner, or if you're not hearing from us, it's not because we're not working on it.
Thanks, Lisa. The only thing, this is Shelley, the only thing I wanted to interject here is Clinical Trials Center of Excellence fee is currently still waived and will likely continue to be waived full until the beginning of next year.
All right, Michelle, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I mentioned startup fees are supposed to cover the effort to prepare for the study for this first subject enrollment. That includes budget preparation, negotiations, contract negotiations. The coordinator spends a lot of time reviewing the protocol, doing case report form training, lab kits, setting up lab and radiology accounts. They have a lot of work to put in before any of these subjects are enrolled. So that is, the startup fees usually cover that time. It also includes for regulatory, the IRB review preparation and the document preparation for the sponsor. So getting started on the budget, there's a few things that we want to look at doing first. You want to determine what services that you need to obtain pricing for. Any procedure that is going to be billed to us we need to get pricing on. I recommend keeping the documentation on that to ensure it throughout the study. You also have to consider if there's any standard of care procedures. If there are standard of care, then those items should not be included in the budget. Identify those things that are needed only for research. Your budget should only include the research services. The schedule of events will include anything that is going to be done for research on the patient. That would include the blood draws, vitals, survey, colonoscopy, case report forms, entering the data into the system for the sponsor. All of those need to be looked at. You want to ensure that the time spent per patient will cover the cost associated with study coordinator's time in completing the budget worksheet. I usually have a coordinator go through and guesstimate the amount of time that it will take to complete each procedure listed. You can contact 2 people for pricing services and their team. It will be the enterprise director for clinical financial integration at WVU Medicine, or the manager of enterprise patient financial services. There's also a link where you can see all the hospital pricing transparencies. One thing to note is those don't include fees for the physician services. Patient reimbursements is always a large factor. You want to give incentive for the patient to enroll in the study. That would include patient stipends, which is usually, for West Virginia, we've been trying to do gift cards. It could be checks, so that includes mileage. If they're traveling 4 hours from Southern West Virginia, they are not going to be okay with losing money to participate. And it can also include hotel charges. If you're going to spend 12 hours in the study and you are from out of town, then you need your hotel covered. With budget negotiations, everything is negotiable within reason. There is no harm in asking the sponsor for anything. If they come back with and don't want to do it, that's fine, but you need to at least ask for everything that you can. If you have already enrolled a participant and you determine that there was a mistake in the budget, an example of like a hotel room wasn't covered for a day that you had to be there for 12 hours, you can always request a budget revision. Next thing you want to do once the budget is finalized is the contracts. With the contracts, you want to make sure that the amount shown in the payment schedule matches the amount negotiated for the final budget. The payment schedule often includes things like travel on a per mileage basis. You can't exactly have that in the budget. You can have up to an amount, but you want to make sure that that matches in the contract. Once you've read through the contract, the budget and protocol, the contract needs to be entered into KC. Legal then begins their review, and they are fantastic to work with, but they will make sure that all the language is correct. Once the contract is finalized, you will be invoicing the sponsor. You want to go ahead and get your startup fees, your Center of Excellence registration fee, IRB fees, document storage. That way, whenever you do get an invoice, you can go ahead and pay that and the award will be set up. You can also notify the senior corporate accountant for sponsored projects. He will then post it in the accounts receivable so we know what we are waiting for. Once the money is received, an award will be set up and you will reference that award on every invoice going forward so that it's easier for sponsored projects to identify what the money is received for. A calendar can be set up in Encore. It would include all the items from the schedule of events. Financial amounts can then be attached to each event, and that way, whenever it is documented in Encore by the study coordinator that a visit has been completed or a task, you can automatically create an invoice in Encore based on the events so that you know what to bill the sponsor. I'm now going to pass it over to Susan Crayne, who does budgets for NIH applications.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about federal side of budgets. Debbie, move to the next slide. So there are various types of funding, but for my presentation, I am going to focus on the federal and to some degree the sub-recipient, because basically it's the same information you'll need in your budget for if you are going to be a sub-award to another institution, maybe you're going to be a site here, we'd need the same information. Next. So the difference between federal budgets and industry budgets, as Michelle just talked about, you're negotiating up front with the sponsor in industry. Sometimes they give you a budget to work with. Your startup costs and IRB fees and everything can be built in, and you get your contract prior to submitting it through KC down to legal here at WVU. With federal sponsors, that's flipped. It's kind of different. So we will have to do a budget on the front end. If you are a WVU health sciences faculty, we will need to do a detailed budget for the Health Sciences Office of Research. And a lot of federal sponsors require a detailed budget anyway, although NIH sometimes doesn't, but we'll talk about that another time. So the budget is put together before it's submitted officially to the sponsor through the Office of Sponsored Programs, and your IRB fees would be covered in the F&A costs, which are going to be our standard rates, not the normal 26% or less for industry sponsored, unless the specific announcement that you're applying to has something capped in that announcement. Next. So my best tips for doing a federal budget is to start as soon as you know about an opportunity. Begin with reading that funding announcement and make sure that your idea fits that purpose. A lot of details are included in the funding announcement. It includes not only the amounts for your budget and whether or not F&A or indirect costs are capped or included in the total or on top of the total. It gives you the funding period and also has specific budget inclusions or exclusions at times. It also gives you a guideline for the most part to write your proposal. So it's very important to kind of read through that and start early, and that way you're prepared for what they're going to ask of you in that and what reviewers are going to look at. The other thing to do would be to create your specific aims and contact the program officer in that funding announcement, and email them is the best way to ask if you can get on a call and discuss your specific aims, and send them your specific aims ahead of time so they can kind of look at it. And that way they can tell you if that's what they're looking for, or even direct you to a better fit for what you're looking to do. If you are in a department who has pre-award support for preparing your grants, that is great. If you are like with the Cancer Center, Winnebeth Smith is amazing. The Office of Research in the Health Sciences has grants pre-award support for non-clinical trials. If your participants are not going to be assigned to an intervention, or if you're not evaluating an effect of an intervention on the participant, it may not be a clinical trial according to NIH definition. So they would be able to help you. If you do not have pre-award support and you are doing a clinical trial, then you can reach out to the CTSI, and I provide grant support for clinical trials for federal submissions. And those are the links in the slides to request support. Next. So let's dive in a little more to specifics in our budgets. So budgets simply outline the costs involved to support your project. And you want to base your budget on actual costs that are reasonable. Why? Because a lot of the times, people who are reviewing your budget are going to know if it's over budgeted or under budgeted. They'll generally have people like me who do this a lot, and they'll know a typical item cost. And you also want to know if you're going to have enough money to do what you plan to do. So if awarded, you want your budget to really be ready to go as soon as you get notice of award and the award is set up, without needing to rebudget and adjust and take time and energy away from your actual project. And the budget really does matter on the federal side. First of all, you can only do what you can afford to do. So knowing exactly how much you're going to need to do your proposed project is really essential. Significant under or over budgeting can also indicate to our reviewers that a PI doesn't really understand the scope of work, or it could impact negatively on the review. And so the purpose of your budget and justification is really to present and justify all of your expenses required to achieve your proposed objectives. And you really want it to be realistic and request only what is necessary and reasonable, and justify everything, especially anything unusual or a big ticket item that might raise a little flag. If it's needed, then we tell them why. So really just a poorly prepared budget can influence your score in a negative way, and a deliberately under or over budgeted project can undermine the confidence in the PI's ability to manage a major project independently. Next. So getting started, again, reading the funding announcement or the RFA and knowing the budget and the limits and restrictions. What type of budget does it require? As I mentioned before, if you're not familiar with NIH, they have what's called a modular budget, where you just request modules in $25,000 increments up to $250,000. But you need to know how many of those you need. And like I said, health sciences requires a detailed budget anyway. And so, but knowing how we're going to submit it is a good thing to know ahead of time. And no other sponsored specific requirements. Do they require cost share federally? Usually they don't, and it's discouraged. And it also requires a whole lot of approval on the WVU side, and know what your project period and your support availability is. So if you reach out to me for help, I just wanted to talk about sort of a pre-award process. And every grant person who I work with closely, I know all of those here at the university who do what I do. So we pretty much have the same process. We're going to meet with you, and we're going to ask a lot of questions because we need a lot of details. So these are questions that I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask who all at the university is going to be involved. I'm going to ask you who any other institutions are going to be involved, because if you're going to have a site in, let's say, the University of Pittsburgh, and we're going to subcontract with them, I need to reach out to their grants people very early, because I need all of their documents before I can route it through here at WVU. So just another plug for starting early. We're going to talk about how many years your project is going to be. A lot of these announcements are for up to a specific number of years, but you might not need all those years. So we're going to talk about what you need. Again, WVU employees, what their % of effort, and in which years. Sometimes you need someone heavy at the beginning and not so much at the end, or vice versa. Hospital employees are really considered a contract, and it takes a bit of time to get their salaries. So again, knowing early on who at the hospital you're going to have in your project is really important to let your pre-award person know. For human subjects, how many are you paying them? What are you paying them for? How many times are you paying them? How much are you paying them? How often are you paying them? You can see a lot of questions. And travel, where will you travel? Who's going to travel? How often? Which years? The supplies you'll need and quantities that you'll need. Will you need laptops or tablets? Printing, if you're going to do surveys, maybe paper surveys or mailing, you want to put in those costs. Postage if you're going to mail. Will you do focus groups or anything that will be recorded? Do you need transcription services, publication costs, or any other dissemination costs? Large equipment, so that is considered pieces of equipment with a unit price of $5,000 or more and a life of greater than 1 year. And then, do you have any consultants? And these would be non-WVU employees. WVU employees cannot be consultants. So if you have consultants, we'll need to know how many hours, what their rate is per hour, and all of that will also need to go in a letter that they write to support your project. So those are kind of a lot of questions that I will ask. These are the components of a standard federal budget, and you get your senior and key personnel, the people who are really driving the science. Other personnel would be your lab assistant, the research coordinators and nurses here, like if you use the CTSI, those types of people are fringe benefits, equipment, travel, other direct costs that don't fall under these categories, and that would also be where your UHA clinical component goes. And then, of course, sub-recipient agreements. And again, equipment, that's the definition of equipment. And we do, if you do have a large piece of equipment, it's best to get a quote and hold on to that so that you have that. And then travel, I calculate travel on real costs. So that's why I ask you all those questions about where you're going, who's going, and how many days, and all of that, because I'm going to look that up and get all of that detail. Other direct costs can include, like I said, anything that didn't fall in those other categories, materials and supplies and lab costs, your software, and again, that's where your UHA clinical component and WVU employee salary go as well. And I believe that might be my last slide.
Thank you, Susan. And Missy's going to present the slides around the UBIT.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you for allowing me to participate. We're going to talk about tax, which is everybody's favorite topic. So let's start with some tax law basics. Before we dive into the UBI, Unrelated Business Income Tax, I want to go over some basics, some things that I think that people don't always think about. The first thing is all forms of payment received is taxable income. That's tax law number one. Everything is taxable, whether it's to an individual or to a corporation. All sources of income are taxable, unless there is an exemption or an exclusion that makes the income non-taxable or makes the taxpayer tax exempt. That's tax law number two. Number one, everything's taxable. Number two, unless there's an exemption or an exclusion. If you understand those two things, you understand tax law, right? Those exemption and those exclusions So that's where tax law gets to become that muddy mess that we have to deal with. And as you dive into those exemptions and exclusions, you're going to find two things. Number one, it doesn't always make sense. And number two, it can seem unfair. You have to realize that tax law has been written over years it's written by our legislators, and then the IRS interprets it. And so there's been a lot of cooks in the kitchen coming up with the tax law that we have today. And so it doesn't always make sense, and it doesn't always seem fair. So if you go in with an open mind knowing those things, you'll get along better. So then the next thing I want to talk about is the tax status for WVU and for WVU Research Corp. I get a lot of questions on this. WVU is tax exempt as a state entity. Okay. We are not a 501c3 nonprofit. We could apply for that status, but there's no need for us to. It would require additional reporting to the IRS, and it's not going to give us anything additional as far as tax exemption. We're tax exempt as a state governmental entity. Research Corp, by comparison, is a separate legal entity from WVU, and they are a 501c3 nonprofit tax exempt org. So what does tax exempt mean? Tax exempt is any entity recognized as a tax exempt entity by the IRS. The next slide, please. So tax exempt is any entity recognized as tax exempt by the IRS that is exempt from paying taxes on their net income derived from related activities, activities related to your mission. And it's just an exemption on net income tax. It's not a blanket exemption on all taxes out there. When we say we're a tax exempt entity, it only means we are tax exempt from income on our net income, on income earned from activities related to our mission. So two exceptions is UBI, unrelated business income. And we're going to delve into that deeper here in a minute. But another exemption, or another exception, excuse me, is something, just to give you an idea, is with relation to sales tax. Sales tax is something that is governed on a state by state level, and it's up to that individual state as to whether or not they recognize WVU or the Research Corp as a tax exempt entity. For example, West Virginia, the state of West Virginia, says we are a tax exempt, we don't have to pay sales tax. The state of Pennsylvania does not recognize us. So if we purchase something in the state of Pennsylvania, we have to pay sales tax on it. So when you're looking at the big picture and you say, oh, WVU is a tax exempt entity, understand it's not a tax exemption from everything. That causes a lot of confusion. So with that, let's go on into UBI. We're going to start with what is related income. Next slide, please. Thank you. Related income is income from any activity that is substantially related to our business purpose. This applies even if we earn a profit, even if we are trying to earn a profit. It's fine for us to do that as long as we can tie it to our mission, which then brings to the next slide. What is unrelated income? Okay, unrelated income is the opposite. Next slide, please. Oh, there you go. Unrelated business income is income generated from a trade or business that's regularly conducted, that's not substantially related to our mission, it's not conducted for the convenience of our members, and it is referred to as UBI. The goal behind UBI was to level the playing field between the for-profit community and the nonprofit community. So bringing this into your world, let's talk about clinical trials for a second. Clinical trials on healthy patients can be conducted by for-profit entities. They can also be conducted by us, right? A nonprofit. It will cost more money for that for-profit entity to conduct that clinical trial because they have to pay income tax. That's why unrelated business income tax came into play. The IRS said, we want to make it fair for that for-profit company that the nonprofit also has to pay tax. So that's where UBI comes into play. They were trying to level the playing field between for-profit businesses and nonprofit businesses like WVU or the Research Corp on certain activities. So let's come down to the next slide. This is the current UBI questionnaire. I've broken it up into multiple slides and we're going to go through it. The purpose of this questionnaire is to help tax services or myself look at what you're doing and determine whether or not it is an activity that is subject to unrelated business income tax. And it also is giving me, it's letting me know if I can tie it to our mission. Is there a public benefit? Is there direct patient care? Is there student education? All three of those areas tie an activity to our mission, and therefore it would not be subject to UBI. The purpose of this questionnaire is for me to gather that information. So I want to emphasize where it says project description. I want to emphasize that when you fill that out, spend a few minutes doing that. Give me some layman terms that a tax accountant would understand. A lot of times it comes through and it's in lingo that is your specialty, and it doesn't mean anything to me. I will defend any activity and say it is not an unrelated business income and that we should not pay tax on it, but I have to understand what's going on so that I can defend it, okay? So I just ask on this one that you take a few seconds, spend a few minutes putting it in layman's terms that the tax accountant can understand what you're doing. So then let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, these are the first few questions on the questionnaire. Number one, if your research project is funded by any other government, federal, state, local government, it is automatically exempt from UBI. So that's an easy question, right? Questions 2A through 2F, the purpose of those questions, I'm trying to establish if there's a public benefit. You know, will the results be made available to the public? If you publish it for your peers, if it's something that you use in the classroom, if it's something that the general public can read and learn from, that's a public benefit. If there's a patent that's going to be owned by a company, then that's not necessarily a public benefit. That's a benefit to that company. So that's why I'm asking about patents. You know, is there going to be a benefit to the general public, including but not limited to something like industry development or retention? Are students involved? You know, that's the university's core. There are students along with research. Students and research, those are our two big ones. It doesn't have to be hands-on training with the students in the lab with you, although that's great. But it can be something that maybe you did, you completed the project and you took it into the classroom and you just taught the students. You taught the students based on the results of your research. You know, so that's a key if the students are involved. Next slide, please. The next part of the questionnaire, it's asking, trying to determine, is it a true clinical trial to a healthy patient? If it's a clinical trial to a healthy patient, unfortunately, that's clear cut in tax law. That is subject to unrelated business income. If it's a clinical trial to a healthy patient. However, if it's a clinical trial or if you're administering the drug, say, to a patient who is sick with a disease, you know, maybe it's a cancer treatment that you are going to administer to a individual who suffers from cancer, that is non-related, or that is non-UBI. That is considered related. Again, I'll go back to, does it always make sense when the purpose of both trials is to find a cure for cancer? One is on a healthy patient, one's on a patient with cancer. Don't expect tax law to make sense. If you administer, if your trial is a cancer drug and you administer it to a healthy patient, then that is a clinical trial that's subject to UBI. If you administer it to someone who is direct patient care to someone who is suffering from the disease, that is not UBI. So that's something to think about. Kind of going along with that, if you're testing metabolic levels, toxicity levels, if it's routine in nature, if you're just testing and designing the products and it's just routine, that is subject to UBI. But if it develops or improves a process or a product or a formula, that's not UBI. So it can depend on the nuances of your project. So let's go to the next slide, please. So kind of key takeaways. If the activity is a clinical trial on a healthy subject, if it's testing the metabolic or toxicity levels, or if it requires routine or repetitive testing, those are subject to UBI. If it's government funded, if we can tie it to the university or the research corp mission, such as there's going to be a public benefit, we're going to have industry retention, we're going to have an improvement to a process, we're going to have our students involved at some aspect, and from an educational point, we can tie it to our mission, or if we can tie it to direct patient care to someone that is actually suffering from the disease, and this will, the drug is being administered for patient care. Those activities are not subject to UBI. So when you complete the questionnaire next time, keep those things in mind. The first page where I ask for the product description, have mercy on the poor tax accountant who's going to read it and make sure that I can understand it because I don't understand the medical terminology. When you're answering the questions, think about tying it to our mission, tying it to our mission, tying it to direct patient care. If we can justify any of those, then it's not subject to UBI. And hopefully then that will help you as you're completing the questionnaire to understand where the questions are coming from and the importance of them. So then my final is my contact information. If you have any questions, you feel free to contact me. We can discuss it. If you think something is kind of on the border and you want to know, we can sit down and talk that out. And that way we can make the right decision as to whether or not something is subject to unrelated business income tax. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Missy. I really appreciate that. And thank you to all of our presenters. And Missy, we did have a kind of a conversation going on in chat. Shelley had asked, when do you complete the UBI questionnaire? And then somebody did respond, a CL Dalton, and their comment was our accountant wants it completed at the beginning of the study. So I just wanted to make sure we talked about that and if that's the same with what you're wanting as your tax services.
Yes, we have found that doing it at the beginning of the study is best because sometimes studies go into multiple years. And if they go into multiple years, then if the PI leaves, if the PI changes, sometimes there's just extenuating circumstances that completing it at the end did not work out well. So we do it up front. Okay. I do not actually see it though until the end. because what we do is if you spend every dollar of your grant, there's no income left over to be subject to tax. The only ones that I actually review are anything where you have a residual. If you have money left over, then you have income from the project. Then I look at the project or the activity and determine whether or not we need to pay tax on that income.
Missy, this is Shelley. And so who does the form get sent to once it's completed by the PI?
The form would go to Vince Alvarez's group, Sponsored Research Accounting.
Okay. So they just keep it on file until the trial is over?
That is correct.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
And I just had, and if you have questions or if you want to take yourself off of mute, I did mute a couple people during the presentation. So feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions, or you feel free to put them in the. We did have just some additional information that was put through in the chat. Just as general information, and this is regarding going back to Michelle's presentation on the budget. The breakdown of the budget's a great way to break out what's being done for the research and what is being done as per standard, which are questions in the protocol submission. So it's also needed in writing the consent for financial considerations and identifying the subjects, what they're doing, that is research. So just to want to provide that additional information that was presented. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments maybe? Because we have a lot of expertise that was presented today, but if anybody else had any other circumstances or anything else they would like to talk about regarding budgets. Great. So thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know there's a lot of stuff going on, with COVID and everything. So I really appreciate you taking the time to attend our presentation today.